Hello, I'm Charles Cumming. I'm the author of A Colder War. You're listening to the Richard and Judy Book Club podcast.
Richard, turn that off! Richard, turn that off!
Now, that is a good job jobbed.
I thought you were only going to prune the flowering crabapple trees.
Well, I was, but once I got the chainsaw out, I kind of felt inspired, so I've made this little ice sculpture, just for you. What do you think of it, Jude?
Well, it's, I think the word is astonishing. Did it really need to be life-size?
Well, actually, it's a tad larger than life, so you can embrace the full majesty of the polar bear with cubs on an iceberg on our pond.
Righto. Thanks. It's really lovely. Really.
Get back into books with Richard and Judy.
Better get inside and get reviewing our latest read, I suppose.
It's A Colder War, and we're hoping Charles Cumming will tell us some tales about his superb spy story.
I'm going to read from the opening chapter, the first chapter of A Colder War, which I wrote as a homage to the opening chapter of The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, John le Carré's great novel of the 1960s. And it begins like this. The American stepped away from the open window, passed Wallinger the binoculars and said, "I'm going for cigarettes." "Take your time," Wallinger replied. It was just before 6 o'clock on a quiet, dusty evening in March, no more than an hour until nightfall. Wallinger trained the binoculars on the mountains and brought the abandoned palace at Ishak Pasha into focus. Squeezing the glasses together with a tiny adjustment of his hands, he found the mountain road and traced it west to the outskirts of Dobezit. The road was deserted. The last of the tourist taxis had returned to town. There were no tanks patrolling the plain, no dolmens bearing passengers back from the mountains. Wallinger heard the door clunk shut behind him and looked back into the room. Landau had left his sunglasses on the furthest of the three beds. Wallinger crossed to the chest of drawers and checked the screen on his BlackBerry. Still no word from Istanbul. Still no word from London. Where the hell was Hitchcock? The Mercedes was supposed to have crossed into Turkey no later than 2 o'clock. The three of them should have been in van by now. Wallinger went back to the window and squinted over the telegraph poles, the pylons, and the crumbling apartment blocks of Dobezit. High above the mountains, an aeroplane was moving west to east in a cloudless sky, a silent white star skimming towards Iran.
This is one of my favourites. It's a cracking spy read. It's absolutely full of suspense and obviously secrets. Thomas Kell. He's a wrongly discredited spy and he's looking for a way back into the game. And he gets his chance when the guy who runs British intelligence in Turkey dies in a plane crash. Now, was that an accident or an assassination? Well, Kell is sent to Istanbul to find out. And he enters a toxic world of lies, betrayal and extrajudicial executions. It's fast, it's tightly wound storytelling with really vivid descriptions of one of the most exotic cities in the world. And the author, Charles Cumming, is here now. I absolutely love this, Charles. I mean, it's a horrible, hackneyed, cliched thing to say, but I couldn't put it down. Really couldn't put it down. Wanted to know what happened again and again and again and kept sort of putting the alarm on and a bit further forward for the morning. Let's talk about the title, A Colder War. It is a sort of a reference to the Cold War in the sense that the modern global war is so much more complicated and therefore, in the definition of the title, even colder. Let's explain that thinking.
There's an emotional reason behind the title in the sense that Kell falls in love in the novel with somebody who changes his life, really, and changes many of his attitudes and... But also, obviously, there's a resonance with the Cold War. And I think people miss the Cold War. I think spy novel readers miss the Cold War.
It's so simple to understand, isn't it?
Exactly. It was sort of black and white and us versus them and Carla and Moscow Center and Smiley, all that stuff. So there's a resonance to the old days to sort of Dayton and Ambler and so forth as well in the title.
Yeah, but the war that we face now is just so much more complicated, and you bring that to life beautifully in the pages. I mean, just talk about that. How would you analyse the way it's changed, the global face-off now?
The difference, the major difference is the antagonist, in the sense of the Islamo-fascist mindset. ISIS or Al-Qaeda is in every way more ruthless and in every way more despicable than communist Russia, the Soviet Union, and in some ways less interesting for that because a brainwashed young jihadi who's going to blow himself up on a bus or cut somebody's head off on a video on YouTube is, I don't think, as worthy of examination as, say, SVR officer who's considering an offer of recruitment from MI6. There's something inhumane, something very obviously inhumane in the activity.
Well, just before we talk about this, just very quick, just to finish this point, just before we talk about Kell and the character and stuff, I'm just old enough to remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was 7. Now, what I remember then was the fear. Everybody was petrified that actually it was going to happen. MAD, mutually assured destruction, was going to happen the next day or maybe the one after that. Do you think that the times we live in now are as frightening as it was in the old Cold War?
It's a strange thing because all of us face an existential threat from terror every day, particularly living in London. We're speaking today, just the day after what happened in Sydney, in the cafe. Or you could be having a cappuccino and somebody comes in and your life changes.
Yep.
And it seems that we've adjusted to that, the idea that you could be in a shopping centre and 15 guys with Kalashnikovs could walk in and create mayhem, or obviously a bomb could go off in a cinema or something. And we just, thank goodness, we live our lives without changing our lives. Whereas I think probably the threat of nuclear annihilation when you were growing up is... and it was close to the war too. Everybody knew about Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and it was just sort of terrifying.
It could happen.
And you felt the thing was out of your hands. It was in the hands of politicians. So if Khrushchev and Kennedy weren't getting on, that was going to directly impact on you and your family. So,
but it's very interesting, that you're writing a spy novel in a world when the spy novel is actually since Dayton and Le Carre and everything, it's a genre, if you like, that seems to have faded. Did you decide to kind of reinvent it because of your own experience? Because you were actually approached, weren't you, to join MI6 when you were younger?
I was. When I started, I genuinely, this is just naivety and a complete lack of commercial nous, I genuinely didn't think that I was writing a spy novel. My first novel was originally called Peripheral Vision, right? And my editor at the time said, sounds like the memoir of an optician. You need to put spy in the title. And I suddenly realized that I was writing it, but I was really trying to just blend Le Carre and Nick Hornby in a way. And I wasn't really thinking about novels of suspense.
Yeah.
But I agree with you that the spy novel was more or less on its deathbed after the Cold War. Even though people said that Le Carre was finished. People said that MI6 and the CIA would just need to be disbanded because there was no more spying.
Yeah.
And I think, as well as the threat from the post 9/11 Iraq climate, people know more about spies and how intelligence officers operate now.
But certainly I think if you think about it, those older spy novels and the James Bond films and stuff like that, they tended to make you think that spying, I grew up thinking that spies must have a really glamorous lifestyle, that they had these amazing adventures in exotic, wonderful cities, etc., etc. And that in the end, the only people who were really threatened were the spies themselves. Now, as you say, it's completely changed. You couldn't describe anything about ISIS or and what's happening out there as having any kind of romantic dimension at all, which it used to have. So how does that make a difference in the way you approach it?
It's a good question.
Well, I can help you on that because you do actually provide a huge amount of glamour. It's called Istanbul.
Yes.
It's a fantastically colourful backdrop. It seems to me that was your way out of that impasse.
It's I think that people are always going to be interested in spying and in spies, and they're always going to think, and you're right, partly because of Bond and partly because of Fleming, that spying is glamorous.
Yeah.
And they're always going to think that spying is one man or woman against some global network of terror. And spying isn't like that. If I was accurate to the business of spying, my books would be very boring and not very suspenseful because it's just a lot of people sitting around in rooms collecting information and waiting and waiting and waiting. So the grammar, if you like, of the spy novel hasn't changed.
Right.
And actually the business of spying hasn't changed. If I want to recruit Richard, the way that I would do that hasn't changed since 1956.
Oh, we'll get more into that. Go on, carry.
How am I going to recruit him?
No, I'm just interested in when you say that. Go
the
on.
answer is yes. I'd serve my country. Let's talk about the spy, Kell. As Judy writes in her review of the book on our website, she likes Kel, as you say, Judy, for his flaws more than anything else, because he smokes 30 a day. He's ridiculously unfit. He's got a crap love life, you know. I mean, he is not, James Bond, he is not. And yet, he is fabulously intuitive, isn't he? I mean, he's got the spy's brain.
I'm glad you think that, yes. I mean, it's always very difficult with writing about men, middle-aged men, not to give them a sort of marital crisis or an alcohol problem or something like that. Or you know, they have a sort of taste for a particular composer or they drink a certain type of whiskey, and it just always felt a little bit fake to me.
Yeah.
I mean, even with respect to Le Carre, like Smiley with his polishing his glasses on the end of his tie. You know, it's just a sort of
the fat end
trope.
of his
But people
tie,
do love that stuff, I think, and they. But giving. I don't just want to tell stories of suspense, spy stories. I want to do it in parallel with novels about people, about relationships, about how difficult life is, quite apart from your professional life, and to try and blend those two together. So in A Colder War, the relationship he has with Rachel obviously crosses, without giving too much of it away, into his professional life in a serious way.
But I think that before the book is absolutely fascinating. I mean, I cannot let you go about this recruitment business because you were, without talking about it, because you were sort of recruited yourself, weren't you? At your parents' house? Is it?
No, you're right. I was at dinner in, I think it was 1995, at my mum's house when my stepfather was still alive, and a friend of his came for dinner who told me that he'd just retired from the diplomatic service. And that night, Yitzhak Rabin, the Israeli Prime Minister, was assassinated. And so we sort of gathered around the television, and I must have said a couple of interesting things about that or something. I don't know. And this guy sort of took to me and contacted my mother a few days later and said, would Charles ever consider going into the Foreign Office? And my mother said, of course he would.
As mothers do.
And then it turned out that I was being tapped up for SIS, for MI6.
Right.
Nowadays you apply online, but and you can still get the tap on the shoulder. But
So if somebody were to recruit Richard, would it be a tap on the shoulder or would he be approached? What do you mean online? What you mean somebody sends you
apply.
an email?
You can apply.
I actually think that
you can apply.
You can apply online,
yeah.
Would you like to be a spy?
yeah, no, you just go to the MI5 website and you fill in some questions. And
I can't give too much.
how
I can't
weird.
give too much away. But to date, I've always said no. Anyway,
that's what they all say.
It would explain a lot, actually.
Thank you, darling.
Actually, give me a good idea for a novel. Like it's perfect.
No, a man has many secrets, and a lot of them are in this fantastic book by Charles Cummings, A Colder War, available everywhere now in paperback, but especially with our partners WHSmith. And as we always say, because it's important, there's excellent extra content only in the backs of the books that you buy from WHSmith that Judy and I have taken part in. There's a Q&A with the author, lots of other stuff. It's and you can take part as well. You can come online and take part and talk to the authors. So there's a lot going on, not least in the novel itself. It's a fine one, and I can't wait for the next.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Charles.
Thank you.
I'm extremely slow and lazy in the mornings, but once I'm up and I've had 17 cups of coffee, I'm good to go. So usually from about 10:30, 11, I'm at my desk and I'll just keep going until 6, 7, 7:30 at night and just try and get as much done as possible. Sometimes I get nothing done, sometimes I have great days, and a good day would be 2,000 words. I have an office in London. Funnily enough, I don't want to jinx it, but the place I've always worked most successfully is a garden shed at my mother's house in Wiltshire. If I'm on a deadline or I need to get a lot done in a short space of time, I'll go there, and for some reason things start to flow in the shed. When it's finished, there's a very good feeling, but then you get into a period of editing and copy editing and galley proofs, which is the most tedious bit of the process. So the writing is better than the editing, but none of it is to be recommended. Having said that, I find it daunting and difficult. I do enjoy it. I do enjoy my professional life, my career, and I shouldn't moan about it or say that it's as difficult as it is. And there's nothing like the feeling of having a good book at the end of it and people getting pleasure from that book. And the book lasting. I love that feeling. So you have some kind of monument. Everything is with you. The sentences are with you, the characters are with you, the plot is with you, the plot problems are with you, the logic, the research, the realism, it's all with you, and you go to bed with it and you wake up with it and you're with it all day. But I don't think it's like an actor who sort of starts behaving like Richard III while he's making a cup of tea. It's not like that. I think J.K. Rowling said that the greatest moment in her career was getting the phone call from her agent saying that Bloomsbury had bought Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, and all of the success and the extraordinary impact that she's had on young readers and on the culture ever since has not compared to that moment. But holding a book, it's very pleasurable, yes, but you don't necessarily think, at least I don't, that's my book. It's just, you just want people to read it, you want people to enjoy it, that's as simple as that.
I like the title of this, A Colder War, because obviously it's a look back to all the novels and all the films about the Cold War, the Russian, Soviet, American, British standoff of, 3-4 decades. And a lot of people thought that, when the war came down and when all that enmity sort of died away and the likelihood or the potential likelihood of a nuclear exchange evaporated, which it pretty much has, that was the end of the spy novel, that was the end of the spy genre. But he's brought it back, and A Colder War really alludes to the fact that it's now much, much more complicated. In the old days, we understood it, we got it. We got the Russian bear versus the American eagle versus the British lion. But all that's changed now, and it's all focused, of course, on the Middle East, but still, the big old players, the Americans, the Russians, the Brits, are still, putting their fingers into the mix. But it's much, much, much more complex.
Yeah.
And he, out of that complex soup, he's made, I think, a terrific, terrific story.
Yeah, and it's a very human story too. I mean, the title, as he sasays, refers to this failed love affair, this terrible love affair he has with this woman he falls in love with. But in terms of spies, yes, you're right. I mean, you think of, certainly people our age, I think of the classic spy novel as being James Bond, John le Carré, Dayton, Frederick Forsyth to an extent, with the Day of the Jackal and all that kind of stuff. It's always vaguely glamorous. It's always fighting, it's always the individual, rugged, handsome, incredibly brave spy, usually British, fighting against these horrible organisations like SMERSH, all these Russian sort of things. And now, of course, it's nothing like that. There's no way that you could think of anything that's going on in the Middle East, or I assume the process of gaining intelligence on them, as being remotely glamorous. It's just horrible.
And also, back in the old days, there was a kind of rule book that both sides sort of stuck to. It was a pretty brutal rule book, but there were things that just weren't done. And now there are no rules. Anything can happen, I mean, and I think that the violence that takes place in this book, the extrajudicial slayings, the executions and the murders that take place, they come at you very randomly. You never expect them. They always come at you out of a sort of a cold page, as it were. Whereas with the old spy novels, you knew when someone was going to be, tapped up, killed, assassinated, whatever. More or less. In this book, it reflects the reality of what's happening in the Middle East and the way that's spreading out through the rest of the world. And it's totally random and almost impossible to predict. And he does that very well on the page. I mean, you are taken aback when these terrible things happen.
I think it's interesting that it is his determination to revive the spy novel, which, as a genre, as he told us himself during the interview, has been dead for about 20 years.
Well, it's great.
Start with one character and I build a whole universe around that character, and these characters just come in and I sound like I have some kind of illness, but basically they talk in my head for the guts of a year. So by the time I actually sit down to tell their story, I have their absolute voices in my head completely. I know exactly who and what they are, what they want, where they're going.
I would say that everything is with you. The sentences are with you, the characters are with you, the plot is with you, the plot problems are with you. It's all with you, and you go to bed with it, and you wake up with it, and you're with it all day. But I don't think it's like an actor who sort of starts behaving like Richard III while he's making a cup of tea. It's not like that.
Maud was living in my head the whole time. And it's quite strange then when people have read the book to hear them talk about your characters and you think, how do you know Frank? How do you know Suki? Because you forget that other people are now kind of privy to that world.
Well, something a bit different next on the Richard and Judy Book Club, exclusive to WHSmith.
People have asked whether I've ever felt like Hemingway's fifth mistress. I spent a long time feeling like I was in bed with these people, mistress, wife and husband.
Mrs. Hemingway is a trip into the complicated love life of Ernest Hemingway as his 4 wives line up to share their marriages.
And yeah, they do come home with you. There's a sense that, they kind of haunt you for a long time. And I think it's taken about a year after the book was published to kind of get these characters out of my system.
Meanwhile, I guess I'd better tidy up outside.
Is it just me, or is that sculpture listing a bit to the left. It's not a bit top heavy, is it?
No, my writing shed!